Welcome back. I'm Baillie and this is Inside Exec. This week we're revisiting a topic from one of our earlier episodes, and we're revisiting it because it continues to generate more feedback and more requests than almost any other subject we've discussed over the years. And that topic is communicating core values. Now, right back at the very beginning, one of our first guests, David Skillen, talked in 3 episodes about it. We've had probably a guest every year mention it or talk about in terms of communication, talk about it in terms of selecting staff, talk about it in terms of executive management. So we thought that it might be a good idea to revisit it once again this year and see what's changed and what's the same. 10 years ago, we explored how organisations identify their values and how they communicate them to the people who work there. The conclusion at that time was fairly straightforward. There is very little point in creating core values if nobody knows them, nobody understands them, and nobody sees them being applied. And in many organisations, that's exactly what happens today. Values are written during a strategic planning session, beautifully framed, placed on the wall, and largely forgotten. But the real question today is whether anything has actually changed over the past decade. In many ways, the fundamentals are exactly the same. Values still work best when the people in the organisation help define them, rather than having them imposed from the top. Because when people participate in the conversation, they use the language that they understand. They explain it to each other, and they develop a sense of ownership of those core values. That ownership is what turns values from corporate slogans into something meaningful. Another lesson that hasn't changed is that values expressed as single words are rarely useful. You see them in lots of organisations. Teamwork, we value teamwork. We value integrity, excellence, innovation. The real question is always the same. What do those words actually mean in behaviour? And I think that is at the core of communicating core values, because we can have those single words as the core values, but what they actually mean is the communication part of it, and that's the important part of it. Why does it matter? Because if 2 people in the same organisation interpret teamwork differently, the word itself has very little value. Values only become real when they are expressed through behaviours that people can see and that they can demonstrate. And that leads to one of the most important principles we talked about in that earlier episode. People don't judge an organisation by what it says its values are. They judge it by what the leaders actually do. And that's both internally and externally. There's a saying that captures this perfectly, and Fuliana used it many times throughout our discussions on this topic. What you say I can't hear, but what you do is shouting at me. If leaders consistently demonstrate the behaviours that align with the organisation's values, people notice. If they don't, people notice that even more quickly. The world that organisations operate in today has changed dramatically in that time since our first discussion on this topic. Firstly, organisations are far more transparent than they used to be. Employees now share experiences publicly on platforms like LinkedIn and Glassdoor. Customers see how companies behave during difficult moments. Investors increasingly ask how values influence decisions around sustainability, ethics, and governance. So values are no longer just internal cultural statements. They are now part of an organisation's public reputation. Secondly, the workplace itself has changed. Many organisations now operate with hybrid or remote teams. Employees may rarely be in the same office or even in the same country. That means that culture and values cannot rely on physical reminders like things on the wall or framed mission statements in meeting rooms. Values now have to be communicated through behaviour in digital environments. How decisions are made, how meetings are run, how teams collaborate, and how leaders communicate. And thirdly, technology has introduced new ethical challenges that organisations simply didn't face 10 years ago. AI, data privacy, algorithmic decision making. These are areas where an organisation's core value must guide choices. In other words, values are increasingly becoming decision frameworks rather than just cultural aspirations. So perhaps the most useful question for leaders today is a very simple one. Can you point to a decision that you have made recently that was clearly influenced by your organisation's values? If the answer is yes, your values are probably real. If the answer is no, they may simply be words. And that leads to one final point I want to make today. Values only truly exist in an organisation when they influence three things: who you hire, who you promote, and sometimes who you are prepared to let go. Because when results are rewarded, even when behaviour contradicts the organisation's values, everyone quickly learns that the values themselves are optional. And that's when they become nothing more than corporate wallpaper. Core values are not the words printed on the wall. They are the behaviours that people believe will actually be rewarded. I'm Baillie, and this is Inside Exec.